Shenmue 3's announcement at E3 2015 was one of the most celebrated moments of the event, on a weekend already filled with power announcements such as the Final Fantasy VII remake and the official revival or re-unveiling of The Last Guardian. It was recently announced that Shenmue 3 will again be delayed to November 19th of this year, a day that will conclude a lengthy and difficult development process and put to test all of the anticipation that the game has invited. But the hype of Shenmue 3, all of the attention it received, is due to the efforts and achievements of the first two games, and the story and world that those games built. Shenmue 3 is continuing a story that by no means concluded by the end of Shenmue 2. But why is it that it took so long for a third game to come into existence in the first place? The first Shenmue game is a game among games during the time it was released, but for how groundbreaking it was, it only sold 1.2 million copies. One could attribute the incredibly underwhelming sales to the limited install base of the Dreamcast, a fact further impressed upon the world once the Dreamcast was discontinued and Sega made its exit from the console wars. The first Shenmue game cost approximately $70 million to develop, including allocations for marketing, though the development for the first Shenmue game was such that it accounted for some of the second. Yu Suzuki, the director of the first two Shenmue games, has stated that the development costs were much lower, to the tune of $47 million, but in either case, the sales were not enough to recoup the budget allocated to the game development. It's not a stretch to say that heavy financial losses that Sega incurred due to the Shenmue games are responsible for the company's exit from gaming hardware. Both Shenmue 1 and 2 were developed by AM2, an iconic name in Sega, responsible not only for arcade classics, but for the entirety of the Virtua Fighter series. The Shenmue games were led by Yu Suzuki as director, who had built up a sterling reputation both within the company and with fans due to his work on games such as Space Harrier and Hang On. Shenmue is the franchise that popularized QuickTime events, an in-game event prompting a button press or series of button presses in order to yield a successful outcome. But it also wouldn't be long after the failure of the Shenmue games that Suzuki would leave Sega to pursue game development independently with his own company, EastNet. It's not that Yu Suzuki was shuttered out after the Shenmue games bombed, he was involved in projects with Sega after Shenmue, including Shenmue Online. However, each of the games he was involved in a spectacular stroke of misfortune, would fail, although for different reasons. EastNet, however, continues to this day and is of course the key development arm behind Shenmue 3, along with the Japanese game development company Nilo, which most recently worked on one of the Jake Hunter games, Daedalus: The Awakening of Golden Jazz, a prequel title. Leading up to its release, and symbolic of the weightiness of the bet that Sega was making in developing Shenmue, the game was heavily promoted in Japan, and Shenmue was also promoted in North America at E3 1999, and at the Game Developers Conference of the same year. Splitting the story of Shenmue into multiple games, a franchise plan made public for Shenmue prior to the release of the first game, makes some sense even if by the time of the second game's completion, the story of Shenmue still wasn't completed. It would allow the company to make more money on effectively the same game, but with different content. It's something akin to the plan that's set for the Final Fantasy VII remake, for which there will be episodic releases. The first game would have established a development pipeline, staff, a gameplay engine, the fundamentals needed to make a game, with future sales recouping initial investment. The sales of Shenmue 2 were reportedly less than that of the first game, leaving hope of fulfillment of that plan to recoup losses as little more than a hope, to say nothing of the Shenmue games being on a dying platform. And this in spite of Shenmue 2 releasing also on the Xbox. It isn't even that the games were seen as bad. Both the first and second Shenmue games reviewed well critically, with the second game often being seen as an improvement upon the first. There's an argument to be made for some players' taste that the games, in spite of all the ambitious realism, can be tedious to play through. Sometimes players have to wait to activate certain scenarios, for example. But that's not enough for others not to see Shenmue for what it was at the time. It's really just that there wasn't enough in sales. And that concludes our video on why Shenmue 1 and 2 bombed. It's rather simple. The games were incredibly investment heavy. The scale of investment needed for the games mirrors the impact and the degree to which they pushed the boundaries of life simulation games and gaming in general at the time. They simply cost too much, and the sales were not enough to recoup the monumental resources needed to develop the games. They would forever be remembered for the impact that they had on other games, and word would travel remarking on the great things that those Shenmue games accomplished. When the Shenmue remasters released, it was noted that the gameplay experiences were solid but representative of the time, arguably both a positive and a negative, with the games being less dynamic and sophisticated than those that followed it, as you might expect. This is most easily illustrated with the Sega franchise commonly described as the spiritual successor to the Shenmue games, the Yakuza franchise. Superficially, both are franchises that are epic stories with QTEs, while the Yakuza world and the locations that were introduced up to the 6th game was populated with more characters and more complicated life simulation systems. It's hard to say what remains for the Shenmue franchise after the 3rd game will hit. So, what are your experiences with the Shenmue franchise? If you didn't play the Shenmue games, did you hear about them before watching this video, and when? Have you had any interest in purchasing the remasters that released recently? The Shenmue games have 2 very important features to it: its dedication to the simulation of realism and the great revenge story it tells, as protagonist Ryo Hazuki sets out to avenge the death of his father. Let us know your thoughts about the franchise in the comment section below, and as always, thanks for watching. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.